Yeah, that's yours.
Well, good morning, men. Great to be here with you this morning. When Ben was arranging all of this, he said, we're doing books that you should read, or books that would be good to read. And I said, oh boy. And then all of the men started sharing what books they were going to present on. I shared some of mine. The list kept growing. I have 20 books, which is absolutely outrageous. I have 20 books in 40 minutes, 2 minutes a book, I guess. So no one timed me on that kind of thing. I did try to think, how could we, have a focus of these? So I would say these 20 books to deliver you from the death throes of our secular liberal democracy. Or you might call it How to Avoid Kamala's Future by Remaining Burdened by What Has Been. So here we go. I have divisions. There's kind of three divisions. The first division will be books that I think help us understand the times. The second would be, key solutions, like key books on the remedy that we need in order to fix this broken down place. And then the final section is simply applications of that key theme, which just kind of goes Kuyperian Lordship of Christ roaming all over the place in the last section. So with that, here's the books. First book is Life in Negative World by Aaron Renn, just by show of hands, who's read that? Life in Negative World. All right, not many of you. The negative world is basically this term that Aaron Renn has come up with. He says there's three distinct epochs in American society: positive world, neutral world, and negative world. Positive world was 1964 to 1994, according to his designations. And he says this was a time in which being a Christian was viewed positively in our land. Of course, that was the sexual revolution and the second wave of feminism and all that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, still being a Christian is something that probably would get you a job, not get you fired from a job. Neutral world, 1994 to 2014. That's where it didn't really matter if you were a Christian. And then negative world, he sets it at 2014 to the present, where you can actually get fired for your particular Christian commitments. He actually talks about the catalysts behind the emergence of negative world in this book, including the dissolution of the WASP hegemony, that is the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant hegemony in our own nation, that kind of Protestant culture and those elites who would shape our culture and do so from a Protestant perspective, well, that dissolved. He talks about the upheavals of the 60s, of course, the sexual revolution and all of that. Now, after reestablishing that paradigm that he's talked about in the past, he goes on to talk about life. How are we supposed to operate? He has three categories: personal conduct, institutional leadership, and missional engagement. And I think he really has some good recommendations for how we can navigate a life in negative world. He talks about the necessity of obedience, which I really appreciated. In our times, you try to come up with some kind of fancy sauce, but just we have to actually obey the Lord. We need to be aware about institutional drift, so institutional integrity, community cohesion. Moscow actually appears in this work by Renn, where he talks about basically obtaining physical assets, this idea of owning the center, actually buying up land and property. And he mentions what's happening here in Moscow as one example of how we should operate in negative world. So I'd highlight that as one key book, and that's very much like, it's just a great appetizer. So if you're like, I'm wanting to know the times, this work is accessible, it's an easy read, it's a good read, it's accurate, so that would be where I'd start. A second book in the Times category would be Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell. Again, by show of hands, who's read that book, Age of Entitlement? This one's a bit more, well, basically what Caldwell's doing is addressing the problems with our legal framework, particularly the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this is the one that will give you bad dreams at night. This is the one where you're like, oh my goodness, we're in really bad shape. Particularly because we now have this stipulation in our land, and have had it now for a good amount of time, that says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex, which is obviously a stupid thing to try to even do. Well, of course we're going to discriminate on the basis of sex. We're going to distinguish. We're not certainly going to domineer over those under our charge. We're not going to domineer over women, et cetera, that kind of thing. But you have to be discriminating in the way that you're operating. And simply because of the 1964 civil rights legislation, what happens now is men just do this in private. They know that there's a problem in the way that they run their business. They're going to have certain standards about who they would hire and who they wouldn't. Of course, the chaos in our military would be one clear example that's all downstream from this 1964 Civil Rights Act. And there's other things you could look to. For example, tax incentives for working mothers. This became a thing really in the 70s. There was an attempt to actually have some like federally established child care, and that didn't work. And so we started to fund it through tax incentives. So now you can get tax incentives. Head Start is one of the programs. All sorts of troubles coming down on the legal front. The Virginia Military Institute would be another example of this. Of course, that was a male-only institute. And then the ladies said, well, here's the problem. You're discriminating on the basis of sex, which you now cannot do. And there's an equal protection clause, of course, in our amendment, and you're not abiding by that either. And so we want to come to the Virginia Military Institute. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Supreme Court Justice, was heavily involved in this decision. Of course, they established a female Virginia Military Institute, but that wasn't right or good, and that wouldn't satisfy. And so there's actually a court case, and now the Virginia Military Institute is no longer a male-only institute. And when you read Caldwell, you'll step back and go, boy, our problem, we're not going to fix these problems overnight. So it just really lets it sink in. We have legal structure, and we're having to figure out how to operate, not only in a negative world where they're looking down upon Christians, but in a society that is now structured in a way contrary to the revelation of God. Okay, third book in this section would be The Total State: How Liberal Democracies Become Tyrannies by Aaron McIntyre. And this is insightful on several levels. I'll give you some quotes from this particular book. He talks about media manipulation of man. So here's a quote from the book. Under what we think of as a more traditional form of government like a monarchy, the will of the people does matter, but it is not the mandate on which authority rests. The king must always avoid becoming so tyrannical that he inspires a popular uprising, but the people being temporarily dissatisfied is not usually a direct challenge to his power. The king is not the king because the people select him every few years. In a democracy, however, the rulers are, at least theoretically, legitimated by popular sovereignty. If the will of the people is the key to legitimating the power of the ruling class, then the ruling class must take an interest in controlling the will of the people. The good news for our elite is that mass media provides the perfect tool for doing this. In a democracy, power is never secure, always up for grabs, with the next struggle only one news cycle away. The point is that in the total state, no media is ever truly about its stated topic, but is rather an opportunity to further state propaganda. So we live in that kind of world in which powerful people are trying to influence the populace by media, and therefore we know there's this detachment and there's this remarkable lack of trust. We know that people are pulling the strings because of the way that our particular order and structure is set up. And so the thing that you need in order to protect against this everything becoming under the tyranny of the state are these strong social institutions that are not the state, primarily the family, but you could go on to certain various organizations and entities that we used to have, particularly in our Protestant heritage, that would not be moved around so easily. But the idea in this particular book is as we become atomized, where we give into like a radical individualism, and we think we can say, we'll have this radical individualism that will still keep the state at bay, that will still keep the state small. McIntyre's book says basically, that's a pipe dream. That hasn't happened. You live in this world in which all of those individuals have now been manipulated by the state, and the state has become total. So, maybe one more highlight from this particular book would be the place of divinity and religion in the state itself. So he was talking about this one writer, De Maistre, I think his name is. De Maistre believes that constitutions do not by themselves create the cultural norms, laws, and institutions that rule over a people. Instead, they simply formalize those that have already arisen naturally out of the character of the people. So as much as we want to go back to the Constitution, the reality is the Constitution arises out of the character of the people. And if that character is not there, then basically you're simply talking about a piece of paper. It's not going to hold you. And he goes on saying, many today would mock de Maistre's assertion that constitutions are divinely inspired and carried out in a religious fashion. The idea that only religion can bind a people into a constitutional order would probably get you laughed out of the average political science department. It won't get you laughed out of the Grace Agenda Men's Seminar, though, which is kind of the point of this particular message. He's indicating right there two problems with, say, our modern democratic liberal order that has been secularized. The two main problems are we are detached from the heavens, so there's no transcendent, where, even if you look in the Bible, of course, there's covenants that are made between God and the people and the king and the people. So we're acknowledging the transcendent in our land. In our own Christian heritage, we have this kind of thing, being one nation under God. McIntyre is saying, basically, if you detach that, you're going to be in trouble. The second problem is being atomized. So this atomized individualism is not actually a way for you to keep the state at bay. You have to have clusters. And we'll see from some other books, I'm going to point out that this is a distinctly Protestant idea. McIntyre does kind of call for solutions, and he talks about relocalization, like as things, the great sort, all of that's happening. And he's got some great encouragements as he's talking about what it's really going to take to relocalize. But basically he's saying what the state has done is broken up the family, and they've made you okay with it because they're relieving you of those family allegiances and duties. Because the fact is, it's really hard. So it's really hard to assume all of your institutional responsibilities, those traditional responsibilities, and we now live in a structure that's incentivizing you not actually sacrificing how you need to for those particular entities, namely your family, or being an alumni of an institution, or being a part of some kind of men's organization that's actually taking time, sacrifice, energy. All of that's fractured. The federal government's now covering that for you and really hoping that you'll be okay with just being passive and enjoying a margarita on the beach. If we can do that kind of thing, then we can fragment our society. So there's a great call to duty and responsibility there. All right, fourth and final book in this particular section of Knowing the Times is called Did America Have a Christian Founding? And Mark David Hall is the author of this book. And this isn't, of course, so much the times, you can tell by the title, but this is to show you how far we have fallen. So it's easy to get steeped in our modern times and forget how things used to be, even in our own land. And I would encourage you to read this particular book just to be mindful of what was going on. I'll give you some samplings from this one. Hall reminds us that the Constitutional Convention met every day of the week except for the Christian Sabbath. And so the framers of the Constitution were not only mindful of the year of our Lord, but also the day of our Lord. Of course, you have the year of our Lord in the Constitution, and as they were meeting to consider that Constitution, they took a break on the Lord's Day. To this day, Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2 of the Constitution reads, if any bill shall not be returned by the President within 10 days, Sundays excepted. After it shall have been presented to him, the Senate shall be, or the same shall be a law. So you still have Sundays accepted in our land. You say, why is that? Well, because we had a Christian founding. And he cites several different examples. Declaration of Connecticut General Court in 1672, so 100 years even before the founding, said, we have endeavored not only to ground our capital laws upon the word of God, but also all other laws upon the justice and equity held forth in that word. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, of course, known as deists, a wonderful story about them that I didn't know about, that he talks about in this book. He said basically it was their job to propose a national seal. And Thomas Jefferson, Mr. Wall of Separation himself, proposed a seal. Imprinted on that seal was Pharaoh's army being buried in the Red Sea, Moses and the Israelites on the other side, praising the Lord with a pillar of fire coming down upon them. And the title that ran around this particular thing was Rebellion to Tyrants is Obedience to God. You say, that's my kind of wall of separation. I mean, that's great. A few other samplings. North Carolina had a state constitutional requirement in 1808 that read, no person who shall deny the being of God or the truth of the Protestant religion or the divine authority either of the Old or New Testaments, or who shall hold religious principles incompatible with the freedom and safety of the state, shall be capable of holding any office or place of trust or profit in the civil department within this state. So there are all sorts of examples like that. Another interesting story about Thomas Paine is found in this book. He wrote his anti-Christian work, The Age of Reason. Of course, now people liked his common sense, but shortly thereafter, Thomas Paine wrote The Age of Reason, and Hall has dredged this up from somewhere. He said it was abominated by the vast majority of the founding fathers. They actually renounced his book, The Age of Reason. He says, including John Adams, John Witherspoon, William Patterson, John Jay, Benjamin Rush, Charles Carroll, Zephaniah Swift, Elias Boudinot, who was a Presbyterian fellow, and Patrick Henry. It was so ill-received in America that Paine was abandoned by all of his old friends, dying in 1809, buried on a farm because even the tolerant Quakers refused to let him be interred in their church cemetery. Only 6 mourners came to his funeral. Okay? So he basically just gives you the landscape. It was just remarkably Protestant. I think he says we were 75% Calvinist as a nation, and he said, and beyond that, it's basically we are at 100%. He said there was a small, tiny batch of Jews, but you need to understand that this is what we are, not only Christian, but then Protestant. Okay, so those are all my books for the times. Now let's talk about the keys to recovery. We live in a secularized time, and now the state have been totalized because of this atomization or this individualization that's gone on. It's just bearing all of it. All of our worldview is baked into the individual, and then we're cut off from the heavens as well. So you might anticipate that the keys to solution are going to be, what is it like to reconnect with one another, corporately or covenantally, and what is it like to reconnect with the heavens, covenantally. And in so doing, how is that going to shape our lives and, of course, our society? So book number 6 I have is Escape from Reason. This is by Francis Schaeffer. The key thing about this book, one is this idea of reason being totalized. G.K. Chesterton says, I think this is an orthodoxy, that the madman is not the man who has lost his reason. The madman is the man who has lost everything but his reason. Okay, so this idea, basically, that Schaeffer's talking about is there's upper story and a lower story. And he says, our great problem is that we don't simply acknowledge the distinction between the upper story, heavens and heavenly things and spirits and angels, and earthly things like physical things, things of earth, all of that. Yes, there's a distinction. He says our problem is we have bought into a dichotomy. Dichotomy being not just a distinction, but we've separated those realms entirely, as if we toggle back and forth between them, as if I'm not looking at spirits right now. Of course, I'm looking at spirits. I'm looking at your body, but you have spirits. We know this. And I have a spirit which is animating my body. If that were to stop, I would fall down dead. It would be a win for me. It would be dramatic for you. But this is the world in which we live. Okay, so it's an enchanted world. It's not simply a materialistic world. It's a world in which God from heaven has spoken to man on earth and actually established something on earth. Something of heaven is on earth, and something of earth is in heaven. This is kind of woven togetherness while acknowledging the distinction. Okay, so Escape from Reason is a very small book by Schaeffer, and it's very accessible. So not only for you reading it, but I think this is a great one to start to build the framework that's going to set up what I think is the instrumental doctrine that will be needed in order to not be atomized and secularized. Okay, but you start by having to break it into this distinction between the heavens and the earth, which Schaeffer does so well in Escape from Reason. 7th book, The Anglosphere's Broken Covenant, Rediscovering the Validity and Importance of the Solemn League and Covenant. And this is by Michael Wagner. This is a very small book, The Anglosphere's Broken Covenant. Basically, he talks about the Solemn League and Covenant. I'll give you a short quote so you can get the idea of where we're going now. This is still a key part of the solution. From the book, Archibald Mason, a Presbyterian minister of the late 18th century, wrote a treatise providing the theological argumentation in favor of national covenanting. After citing examples of Old Testament covenanting mentioned above, as well as others, he continues as follows. These scriptures plainly prove that God's covenant with Israel was made with them in their public national capacity. It was not made with one of the tribes or with some individuals in all the tribes, but it was with the whole body of the people that this covenant was made, and to all of them its obligation extended. The covenanting, therefore, that is warranted in the days of the gospel to be carried on in the Christian lands may and ought to be transacted by them in their public national character. So he's basically laying out this idea. Now, you see this in the book of Kings. Athaliah is the only usurper of the throne, in Judah. She's the only one who sat on the throne of Judah from Rehoboam all the way to Zedekiah at the end before the Babylonian exile. She's the only one who wasn't a son of David. Everybody else was a son of David. And when that was broken off, you had Jehoram, not Jehoram. Jehoram was Athaliah's husband. You have Jehoiada, who was the high priest, actually establish a covenant with that one grandson that she didn't kill. Establishes a covenant between God and him and the people. And this Anglosphere's broken covenant idea, you're seeing that's what was going on with the Solemn League and Covenant. Now, this book actually says all of the nations that basically are daughter nations of the Solemn League and Covenant are indeed still in covenant with God, nationally, because God takes that kind of thing seriously. If you get together and you say, God, we are your people and we will serve you as a people, then something actually happens. So you live in a world in which that kind of transcendent covenantal interchange and interaction actually takes place and then has binding effects on how you're going to operate in the future. So it's vertical and it's horizontal. Another book in this section, so this is a Shameless Self-Promotion, is my book called The Case for the Christian Family. And all of that is about the kind of the recovery of the covenantal family. And so you're going to hear similar things that I've been talking about here addressed in that particular book. What does it mean that it's the Father in heaven who covenants with man on earth? And when he does so, the key theme I'm trying to develop, I basically am using marriage as a paradigm for understanding God's covenant with his bride. So there's marriage between one man and one woman, and what do you hear when a man is married to a woman? So in my instance, my wife's name is Heather, and the minister said, for the very first time, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Jared Longshore. You say, what's that about? Why not her name? Right? Well, because the two shall become one flesh. There's this one new entity. There's this one new thing. Now, we're still individuals, so we appreciate that. But we're acknowledging the corporate reality in that covenant bond, that there's this new thing that now exists in the world, and God's going to deal with that new thing as a thing. Okay? Now you say, does God have a bride? The answer is yes. That's the church of the living God. And the church of the living God is a real thing. It's the body of Christ. The Apostle Paul says that we are one bread, that idea. We are in the world, and he is doing something with us in the world. So a real bonded entity, bound to one another as members of the body of Christ. That idea is what's going to keep us from dissolving into that secular total state, manipulated as mere individuals by the powers that be. That idea of covenanted reality is going to have to be recovered in the minds of the people if we're actually going to resist what's happening to us. It can't simply be, we really need community and we really need a club. So at some point, we need all of these various entities, but we actually need people whose minds have been transformed and understand that the Church of God is a real entity that exists in the world that will then resist tyranny when it comes. So the case for the Christian family, mostly focused on the Christian family, but tied into that idea of covenant as well. My ninth book. I'm doing pretty good here. I think I've got 15 minutes left, and I think we're going to make it. So ninth book is The City of God. Now, that's pretty crazy, and it's ambitious. So anybody read The City of God? Nice. This is like the most popular book so far. Everybody here must be some kind of classical scholar, I guess. The City of God is 1,000 pages. So read at your own risk. I do think that this is a great book for the next generation, and it's tied into all of these ideas. Why? Well, you had this Alaric the Barbarian who takes Rome in 410 AD, okay? And I think Augustine's like middle-aged by then, and he's in northern Africa. So the barbarians are at the gates. The barbarians have come in. They sack Rome. They take Rome. But Rome, of course, you go back just a century, had become a Christian people, right? And people fled Rome, came to North Africa, and they were making the case to Augustine, hey, Christianity's to blame for the downfall of our civilization. Christianity's to blame for this. If we would have just kept worshiping our pagan gods. Now, I wonder how like a modern day evangelical, as we're our own nation seems to be on a downward trajectory, how would you respond to such a charge? I imagine just a faithful gospel-preaching evangelical will be like, we make you no promises about what's going to happen in this life, but we'll get you to heaven. Something like that. And that's manifestly not what Augustine does. Augustine says, your pagan gods didn't deliver you. They didn't protect you. And he immediately is arguing for the benefit of Christianity to your life. He actually says, people hid in churches, and those barbarians didn't go into churches and didn't slaughter the people. You know why? It's because there's a God in heaven. And he cares about his people, and he protects his people. And so he immediately shows the insufficiency of these pagan gods to actually give them any kind of earthly welfare and any kind of heavenly welfare. And by contrast, the Christian God who gives us both this earthly and heavenly, all of these kinds of blessings. And then he details this city of God, the kingdom of God, the church of God, which is on earth, which is advancing amid the city of man. He talks about the origins of these two cities, the city of God and the city of man, the development and progress of these two cities, and then the ends of these two cities. So if you wanted to do a deep dive, I think the city of God is preparing people not to be manipulated by some kind of Gnostic idea that it's just us and Jesus, and let's not try to labor for reformation here on earth, because God hasn't promised that. I think City of God will be a great help there. Okay, book number 10. And with book number 10, we're going into the section of applications. So we've gone understanding the times, and then we've gone key books and understanding the solution. It's going to be a recovery of this covenantal idea, this corporate idea as well. Now, where should we push all of this? So a variety of applications. And I've kind of given every one of these books a particular topic that it addresses. So for anthropology, that is the doctrine of man, consider The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman. He has a great line in there. He opens up with saying, basically, if I told my grandfather that I am a woman trapped in a man's body, he would simply deliver me a horse laugh. That's all that he could do. And he said, and we don't laugh that way, and it's not simply because we're afraid of what CNN might say. It's actually because we have the same instincts. We're basically all trans now. The way we think about humanity is that the real me is inside of me, and it's my duty to express my inner self to you, and that's what really makes me a human. And he basically breaks that down and shows that this is a bad idea. I remember he's got a line in there about dancing. He said, so we used to reinforce this corporate idea by dances where people would dance together in some kind of group. He says, now we don't dance with each other, we dance at each other as we gyrate in a nightclub, like that idea. You can even see in our cultures and customs, this atomization has occurred. This has happened with institutions. He said, institutions used to be looked at as things that would form and shape us. Okay, form and shape us. I'm going to use this at NSA, Ben. I haven't actually thought about applying this. Students, it used to be that students would go and it'd be like, I'm at this institution. And they're like, great, this is what you're going to learn. And they were like, okay. Now it's like, you're at an institution. This is what you're going to learn. It's like, well, why should I learn that? Why should I take that class? And I don't think it's all bad. I appreciate a world in which you actually need to have a good product and deliver that product. But that's a radical change in the way people approach institutions. It used to be that institutions formed and shaped us. And Trueman says now institutions are platforms upon which we express our individual selves. So you are here to equip me to express myself, and I know my calling in life, and can you equip me for my particular calling in life? It's just this whole other kind of framework that has taken place. So The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self is a great book. I would go with the bigger version, not the abbreviated version. Even if you only get 50% of the bigger version, it's going to be good. Number 11, Eschatology, a book by Keith Matheson called Postmillennialism. Basically, once God has established this real corporate entity on the world, and we have this connection between the heavens and the earth, what's the promise about that entity? Is it going to die, shrivel up and die, or is it going to succeed? And I think you really want to drill down and make sure you know the text and the exegesis of why you are a postmillennial. Number 12, a book on natural law. And this book is called The Debate That Changed the West by Ruben Alvarado. As there is a recovery, particularly, say, among the new right, there's a conservative Christian right, and there's talk about theonomy, and there's talk about natural law more and more. I think this book was a fascinating read. Basically, Ruben Alvarado gives you two guys. One guy is named Hugo Grotius, and the other guy is named Althusius. Grotius is an Arminian, and Grotius is some natural law scholar. But in developing his natural law, he made a great error. He basically said natural law would exist even if God didn't, which is a really bad idea. If you're interested in that natural law conversation, which is going to be having an impact upon what it's going to look like to legislate, right, in a real Christian society that we're after, I think the natural law conversation is important. This is a bit of a deep dive, but it would be fun to go, okay, I know that natural law is bad. Now let's talk about, let's hear what we have to say about some kind of natural law that's actually connected to God or revealed from God or implanted in man by God and written on his heart. You could deal with all that. But I think the natural law, the debate that changed the West, will be a quick read on understanding how natural law really went wrong with a guy named Hugo Grotius. Book number 13, Just War. How are we to think about war? Interestingly, if you look back at even Rutherford, if you look at Rutherford or others that would address whether we should go to war. Of course, we have Ukraine, we have Russia, we have the South China Sea, we have Israel. But our forefathers could not even think about going to war without considering protecting Christendom. I'll just shoot real straight with you. It didn't even comport, right? So even the American Westminster Confession of Faith would talk about the civil magistrate's duty to protect the church. Okay, that's the American version, not the heavy-hitting old Westminster version of what the civil magistrate's duty was. And so if you're going to try to figure out whether to go to war apart from any sense of defending the faith once for all delivered to the saints, like if it's just about oil, I'm going to tell you that's an insufficient worldview and background to actually make that decision. Okay? So I'm all for the principles of just war. But what you'll find is you toy around with them. For example, so this book is a very good book, A Basic Guide to the Just War Tradition by Eric Patterson. That's the book. And he details just war in remarkable fashion. One example about whether you should get into a war would be, say, a just cause. Self-defense of citizens' lives, livelihoods, and way of life are typically just causes. But think about that. Self-defense of your people's lives or their livelihoods or their way of life. Right? And Putin says, well, you guys just kept coming. NATO just kept coming. And so I had to defend the livelihoods. And are you ready to defend? You can't actually supply answers to these categories without a Christian worldview, without a Christian conception, without understanding what the state's duty is, when it should be engaged and when it shouldn't be engaged. But this book by Patterson will be very helpful to at least give you a list. He really works through the details. I won't give them all to you, but he gives the principles of just war that I found very helpful. All right, number 14. This category is worldview, and the book is Notes from the Tilt-A-Whirl by N.D. Wilson. So I imagine, raise your hand if you've read this one. Several of you have. When I was reading this book for the first time, I was not here in Moscow yet. I was still living in Florida, and I still remember reading it. I was on the back porch, and my wife was like around the corner, and I was like, babe, Nate Wilson is crazy. I was like, he's crazy. And I kept reading, I'm like, he is really great and really good. So I'll give you a few quotes. He says, I look around at the stuff of the world and I ask myself what it is made of. Words, magic words, words spoken by the infinite, words so potent, spoken by one so potent that they have weight and mass and flavor. They are real. They have taken on flesh and dwelt among us. I see craft in the world. I cannot watch dust swirl or the sidewalk without seeing God drag his finger, or listen to spring rain running in the streets without hearing him roll his R's. He actually says, you are word made flesh, which makes all the people that are doctrine like, don't make me nervous. And he goes, Jesus is the word made flesh, but what's creation? And God said, and God said. So we're in a desperate need of recovery of knowing the nature of reality. Like, what is the pulpit? What is the chair? And this basically is this very he's crossing that Schaefferian distinction in the way that he's talking about creation and having you understand the world. You live in this enchanted world. You live in this world in which God has spoken to you. It is not merely materialistic, but there is something potent from heaven here among us. Okay, number 15. Politics. This is a book called Politica by Althusius. So the guy I mentioned earlier, all I'll say is that this would be more of a deep dive, an older book. If you want to think, what would it look like to actually structure all of society according to this Christian revelation, right? Not in this secular liberal democracy way. Go to Althusius. Again, that's going to be a tougher read, but also a good one. Number 16 is on parenting. To 1,000 Generations by Doug Wilson. Certainly you all are familiar with this book, I imagine. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so, particularly because you'll tie in all of these ideas. What Pastor Doug does in that book is show the corporate nature of the family, and that the promises of God are not only to us, but to our children. If that's true, then he's dealing with the family as this blocked entity. He calls it this molecular bond that he's made promises to about flourishing. And it's by faith in those promises that we see those promises come to pass and, of course, are not manipulated by this overweening state. Number 17, this book is on pragmatics. It's a book called Up from Conservatism. This book, I believe the Claremont Institute is behind it. And it's very much pragmatics. So you're not going to agree with everything in this book, but if you're the kind of person that's really interested in kind of political solutions, like what could we actually do? What's feasible? What's within range on a host of topics? So they have strategies for liberal institutions. For example, they have education. How should we approach education? Theo Wold, a friend of New St. Andrews College, has a section in that book, or a chapter in that book, on the administrative state and how swollen it is and what might be done about it. So if you're looking for something that's very practical, that's a good book. Number 18 is a book on creation called The Supper of the Lamb by Robert Capon. He has a whole section, maybe a whole chapter on cutting an onion, which is always fun. He's dialed into creation itself. He has recipes littered throughout the book. So it's this recovery of the goodness of the created world. Book number 19 is on tactics, and this is Rules for Reformers, also by Pastor Doug Wilson. I won't say much about it. I think someone else might be addressing this book, or Principles of War, which is very similar to it. But basically, if you say, okay, my lights are turned on that our society is falling apart, I'm ready to dig in and actually labor for a recovery along the principles that have been established in these other books, and you wanted to put something into play, that's the book to read. Like, how do we actually establish an objective? How do we keep up the offensive? How do we have security as we're actually trying to labor for a cultural reformation? My 20th and final book is Jeeves and the Offing by P.G. Wodehouse, which, if you can see by my other reading, sometimes I just need to take it light and take it easy. After you've read The Total State and some of these other texts, you're going to want to read a book like P.G. Wodehouse. If you haven't, it's just great stuff. Primarily, you're reading it because he is a brilliant writer, and it's fun. I don't remember anything about the plot of Jeeves and the Offing, but I don't need to, because you have great quotes like this. So I'm just going to give you a litter of quotes, and then I'm done. If you want to talk about a disciplinarian, say, he waited the receipt of 6 of the juiciest from a cane of the type that biteth like a serpent and stingeth like an adder, as the fellow said. You run into a tricky lady. You never knew what she was going to do next, or into what murky depths of soup she would carelessly plunge you. If you're nervous, I was handkerchiefing my upper slopes, which had become considerably bedewed. You could say that your friend is stubborn, or you could say she continued to dig her toes in like Balaam's ass. A shrewd old lady who's always hovering over you. Her name's Ma Cream. Ma Cream, modeling her strategy on that of the Assyrian who came down like a wolf on the fold. Of course, that's Lord Byron, the destruction of Sennacherib that he just works in there. He's always avoiding marriage. He's a bachelor. This Bertram Wooster is a bachelor, always avoiding marriage, and it seems like ladies kind of stalk him a bit. He says, she had expressed in set terms her intention of lugging me to the altar rails and signaling the clergyman to do his stuff. Or if you're dealing with redheads, a redhead lady was called a carrot-topped Jezebel by somebody. And he said, I know if anyone called me a carrot-topped Jezebel, umbrage is the first thing I'd take. An unhappy lady, she pursed the lips, knotted the loaf, and ate a moody piece of crumpet. Or when you're talking about your aunts or your aunts, I'll go with aunt. Aunt Dahlia's eye, while not in the same class as that of my Aunt Agatha, who is known to devour her young and conduct human sacrifices at the time of the full moon, has lots of authority. When you're defeated, they were like a couple of Napoleons squelching back from Moscow. Or another one on aunts. I never see this relative without thinking how odd it is that one sister, call her Sister A, can be so unlike another sister, whom we shall call Sister B. My Aunt Agatha, for instance, is tall and thin and looks rather like a vulture in the Gobi Desert, while Aunt Dahlia is short and solid, like a scrum half in the game of rugby football. So, if you've never read Wodehouse, I encourage you to read Wodehouse. He'll be a refreshing book to read in the midst of chaotic times. Thanks for having me.